by my boss, so people won't quit asking me for sandwiches. That should work, right?
I don't know what you're talking about, Space Ghost.
Go ahead,
My show was
Harness the power of the sun.
No, it's definitely stick. Stick.
Go get 'em. How's it going, man? Ow! No! Ow! Ow! Not there! Ow! Ow!
Are you still here?
Welcome to the program.
I'm sorry. I thought the show was over.
It started?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg's Mark Miller.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Mark Miller. I'm the global editor of Bloomberg Live Experiences, and on behalf of Bloomberg, I'm thrilled to welcome you here to Bloomberg House. You know you're in the right place when it's standing room only. So thanks for squeezing in, and if you would, please try to keep the corridors open. Our friends with the fire department would appreciate that. Some of you may know this if you've been to any of our Bloomberg offices around the world. We greet our visitors with our famous pantries, so I hope you had a chance to get coffee and some food over here. If not, they'll be over there throughout the program. And so I'm excited to kick off the first of our breakfast conversation series. And we're going to start with a panel discussion, South-South collaboration in a new global paradigm. And this is brought to us by our friends at Brand South Africa and Naspers. And this will be followed by two news interviews with the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, and after that, the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella. And that will be, I'm sure, a very interesting series of conversations. So let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Bloomberg's Christine Cook, and her guests. Thank you.
Coming up, gentlemen. Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be here this morning with a very esteemed panel. I have Minister Galangwana, the Minister of Finance of South Africa, and Minister Ibrahim Patel, the Minister of Trade, Industry, and Competition. And even though there is an empty seat, and a very busy man. Hello. No, it's good. I think we all experienced what you experienced. A lot of early birds kept the traffic a little congested. Welcome. So let's get into it, gentlemen. Driving South by South partnership in an area of globalization This is a key topic for South Africa. And with shifting international relations driving a new era of re-globalization, which reshapes trade. And not only that, it drives new partnerships forged as other nations seek to share and shore up their supply chains and labor. The establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area and the expansion of BRICS both signal a rise in South-South partnerships and economic integration between and within regions. So I'd like to start with you, Minister Georgieva. South Africa recently hosted the 15th BRICS Summit, where it was announced that 6 new members are joining. Indeed, 5 have joined as of January 1st. How will this enlargement impact the existing economic order, and what opportunities does it present to South Africa and fellow BRIC members?
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, let me say the idea behind BRICS, I mean, I know people tend to think that we're ganging up against anybody. It's not a ganging up against anybody. The idea of BRICS is to develop a common agenda, a common developmental agenda. And to that extent, we've been made progress in BRICS before the enlargement. By the way, we formed the National Development Bank, and as a result of that, we've started the extension in the bank, the BRICS Bank. We started the extension there, and now we have also extended that on the political arm. Lastly, to consolidate our developmental agenda. And I must also confess also to fight together for a reform of the multinational institutions. Those are some of the key objectives, if I can say, the minimum program.
Minister Patel, for you, where is the continent primed to benefit from these shifts? And which industries in particular hold the most promise for growth in South Africa?
Well, hello, Kristalina. Let me say that the new focus on BRICS takes place at a time with other significant developments globally. We live in a world that's more fractious, a world that is more volatile, and at the same time, the COVID experience and the war in Ukraine showed companies, but also countries, the enormous expense that we all incur when you have supply chain disruption. And so I think we're coming into a new world now. Your question is specifically focused on the African continent. Consider, by way of context, some metrics that shapes our thinking on the continent. Africa accounts currently for 17% of the world's population. It is the fastest growing continent demographically. 1 in every 2 new babies born between now and 2050 will be African. And so we're looking at a population that will be significantly bigger than 2 billion people. We'll overtake China and India fairly shortly in population. At the same time, Africa accounts for 3% of global GDP. And if you take a metric of industrialization, let's say steel production, or let's say car production, it accounts for about 1% of global output. Therein lies an opportunity. But that opportunity needs to be seized by changing the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. We need a new grand bargain as Africans that will unlock the opportunity for industrialization. And the critical deficit as we see it is in the industrial sphere, in growing our manufacturing sectors. Not only the traditional ones, we want to grow, for example, clothing and textile, but also in some of the technology-led sectors. So the technological changes also provide an opportunity. We've seen in communication leapfrogging. We see an enormous opportunity now for the continent to do more. But why hasn't it done it? It's done that because we've had 55 separate little blocks with about the same population as China or India. So that's what we're trying to change with, among others, the African Continental Free Trade Area and our new thinking about how we leverage mineral resources to fuel a drive for industrialization.
So manufacturing, primarily, you mentioned a couple of things there in like clothing manufacturing, but you also did mention, responding to COVID in the future. Are there other industries like pharmaceuticals or that are important to you in this?
Yes. So perhaps by just way of illustration, Africa is a very significant net importer of pharmaceutical products. During COVID-19, we were left with an enormous challenge. We could not access vaccines. And so South Africa tried to repurpose our industrial capabilities. We started to produce the J&J vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine using our industrial base and supplying to other African countries. So the point really now is to change that by fostering greater industrial development in areas like pharmaceuticals. I'm happy to say last year we announced that for the first time we're going to produce human insulin in South Africa for the African market and a few other things. But it's also car production, autos, very significant, and perhaps we can talk later about that.
Well, talking about a unified Africa, you're a very busy man. It's been 2 years since the AfCFTA has come into effect, and the deal promises to boost intra-African trade by more than 80% and lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty. But there's still a lot to be done. You've done a tremendous amount. How can African nations work together to boost trade and growth?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I want to express my appreciation to be here with the honorable ministers this morning. When we started this journey in 2020, the world was in deep crisis, and as we see now, those crises have intensified. Minister Patel mentioned the public health crisis at that time, as well as the geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions, which really had a very, very materially adverse impact on the African continent, particularly in respect of global supply chains and their disruptions. To give you an example, the African continent, export markets, Africa's exports to the EU reduced by over 40% within a very, very short space of time. So what was very clear to us is that without disengaging from global supply chains, the African continent has to take steps, very concrete steps, to ensure self-sufficiency, to ensure that we have supply chains on the continent that will enable the African continent to respond to various crises, which we are seeing now. And this, one of those responses is the trade instrument, the AfCFTA. Minister Patel mentioned the auto sector, pharmaceuticals. There's also agriculture that we are looking at. Africa imports over $50 billion worth of food per year. We're a net food importer. And yet we have the food products, the agricultural capability on the continent. And so to put all of that together, moving beyond the nuts and bolts of a trade agreement, but to really create an African continent that can respond to challenges of the day and the future, and also position itself for future growth. The ministers mentioned that by the turn of the century, 2050, the African continent will have the largest working force in the world. But if we continue to be a fragmented market, a market that has over 42 currencies, a market that is fragmented in terms of rules for investment, for trade, for competition policy, we will not succeed. We will forever remain a continent of potential. But I believe that with the AfCFTA, we are on the right track of creating a single market that will be globally competitive.
Go back to where you're going. Can you share with us, what do you think are the most essential catalysts to start that change? If you had to think of what are the top 3 catalysts that would move towards that really important but ambitious goal?
I think a continental industrial development strategy and a continental industrial development plan to make sure that we overcome the deficit that Minister Patel mentioned of contributing less than 3% to global trade and global growth. We need to establish centers of manufacturing excellence across the African continent. Second, Africa's economy is increasingly becoming a digital economy. And here we have very, very unique opportunities. For example, we know that across the length and breadth of the continent, we have young Africans who are really at the cutting edge of digital innovation for mobile banking, for payment system, and a range of other digital enablers of the economy. So for me, this is the second. The third and final point I would say is in respect of inclusion of young people and women led small medium enterprises, which has been our emphasis for the last 2 years.
I want to come back to that in a minute, but if I can switch back to you to the point of the catalysts that were identified and the things that need to change. When you think about that, how do you think about what structural reforms South Africa is leveraging to boost productivity, which would be in tandem with this more of a unified approach?
Let me just make 2 points before coming to the South African one. Just jump on the 2 points my colleagues have dealt with. On the sectoral stuff, one of the things around climate change, if we were to talk about investment in energy, that's one of the sectoral actors which is going to be critical. As part of climate change, most countries on the African continent are going to require massive investment on the energy stuff. Secondly, on the African continent aspect, what are kind of the key questions? I was in one meeting where somebody said, I've invested in South Africa, but I need more copper. There's copper in Zambia, but I can't get the copper in Zambia because of infrastructure challenges. I've got to get the challenge, the copper in Asia. So the second aspect to this African continent, Africa, is trade facilitation infrastructure. I wanted to pay those 2 things before coming back to the South African situation. If you look at the South Africa, there's been a number of things we are doing to deal with structural reforms. Key amongst them, one of the key perennial problem we've had has been on the energy front. Massive structural reforms we're dealing with in dealing with that question. A new challenge has been the logistics sector, where we're investing a lot in it. And thirdly, we've been trying to change the skills composition. To the extent that we don't have them, we've provided an environment where we can import skills with ease. So there's a lot of structural reforms which we are engaged in order to make sure that we can grow the economy and be competitive.
So back to you with the lens on South Africa. Africa is home to the world's largest and youngest and fastest growing population. And you mentioned how important the youth are. I know in talking about preparing this next population, what do you think are the key things that need to be done to prepare this fast emerging workforce and the next generation that will benefit from all the work that you're doing in your role?
Well, there are efforts at national level and regional level, and I have no authority to talk to those, but from a continental point of view, preparing young Africans to take advantage of a market of 3.4 trillion United States dollars. As I mentioned earlier, digitization of Africa's economy is critical, not only for inclusion, but also for competitiveness. So we are at the cusp of concluding a protocol on digital trade, as well as a protocol on women and youth in trade. And these 2 protocols will actually be the very first of their kind in the world. We will develop legally binding obligations that will ensure that we move beyond aspirations about women-owned businesses, SMEs in particular, and beyond aspirations about young people inclusion in the economy, that we translate those aspirations into legally binding obligations to create opportunities and to eliminate barriers for trade. Africa will require over 700 data processing centers. And this competitive advantage, in my view, this places the African continent in a competitive advantage to really position herself as the data processing, managing, and engineering center of the world.
That's
And when you look at already the investments that are happening in just outside of Nairobi, in Naivasha, Kenya has a green data center. Cabo Verde is developing capacity in data processing. So I think the digital economy is an immediate opportunity for us to prepare the African continent for the future, and the young people that all of us are deeply concerned about, so that we reduce and eliminate the number of young Africans who are buried deep in the oceans of the Mediterranean when they are going to Europe in search of the second and point that I think is it goes to your question, and that is the role of agriculture. We have opportunities in the agricultural sector, agro-processing, that can create jobs for young people. A lot of people don't know that actually Zimbabwe is potentially the largest exporter of grains on the African continent, followed by Ethiopia and Uganda in the area of wheat. So there are certain areas where I believe we have a very unique opportunity to accelerate Africa's growth, to contribute to Africa's overall GDP per capita. But these potentials have been constrained by fragmentation of our market.
Yeah.
And that's been the big challenge, which is what the AFCFTA is there to address.
Minister Patel, South Africa is home to 40% of the 345 African companies over $1 billion in revenue. What can other economies learn from the experience fostering a competitive business environment and passing structural reforms? And how can trade ties and partnerships supercharge industries and business?
Well, Christine, let me start by saying I don't think we have all the answers. But from our experience, I'd perhaps pull out, let me say, 3 or 4 key issues that I think not only from a South African point of view, but looking more broadly at the continent, are matters that are germane to faster growth and more inclusive growth. The first one really is the importance of infrastructure. For businesses to locate in a country, you need to have both the soft and the hard infrastructure. From the skills development entities, your universities and training colleges, to the hard infrastructure of transport logistics, bandwidth and fiber optic, as well as, of course, energy as critical elements. The second part of it is rule of law and contract enforcement. That attracting businesses is about them knowing that when there are disputes, there would be a fair adjudication process to resolve those, and that contracts are capable of enforcement and are indeed enforced. A third one from the South African experience is the importance of innovation. We recently hosted the AGOA Forum. Sub-Saharan Africa has preferential access to the United States market through a piece of legislation in the United States called the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA for short. And as part of the forum, about 30 African trade ministers and the US administration gathered in Johannesburg a few months ago. And at that forum, we had this large Made in Africa exhibition, more than 500 firms showcasing their work. And American visitors were struck by the level of innovation, by the industrial capability, from digital strengths in the digital economy to the advanced manufacturing skills, to how strong the food supply chain capabilities are, pharmaceuticals, heavy chemicals, equipment manufacturing, and so on. So innovation plays quite a key role in fostering the storyline for South Africa. And the final one is access to markets, building demand. The business case of any firm, any investor, is fundamentally dependent on there being demand for products. And so, if I take the example of the auto industry, historically the African continent had an arrangement where second-hand vehicles, used cars that were discarded effectively or sold off elsewhere, were then exported to the African continent. It damaged demand. South Africa took a different path. We didn't permit that. It fostered demand for vehicles in the domestic market, and that attracted global OEMs to produce there. Our access to global markets, we have access to the United States, we have agreements with the European Union and the UK as South Africa, free trade agreements, and of course the big prize is the African continental free trade, building capability and demand on the African continent.
Well, gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure, and I wish you all continued success. We have to wrap this session and move on, so thank you all very much. I'll now pass it to my colleague, Lisa Abramovich, who's going to follow up with another discussion. So, gentlemen.
Hello, I want to welcome all of you here. I'm supposed to warm you up while they move some chairs out, so bear with me. I'm so glad to say that coming up, we have one of the most important people to speak to at a time where there is a theme of rebuilding trust. How do you do that and bring people together at a time of severe distrust? Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, will be joining us here to really talk about how they're seeing this. They also just put out a paper on artificial intelligence. Seems somewhat contradictory to talk about both artificial intelligence and rebuilding trust at a time where a lot of people distrust what could potentially be coming down the pike. As soon as these people clear out, Kristalina Georgieva will be able to push her way onto the stage. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. All right, are we all set up?
Yes, we are.
All right, great. So, as we were saying, Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF since 2019, quite a time to be going through all of these changes. And you recently wrote a paper on artificial intelligence. And I want to start with just asking you about which countries you see benefiting the most and which you see being left behind in the most severe ways.
Let me start by saying that this summer, during my birthday celebration, I got a very interesting present. The nerds in my family, the younger people, gave me a portrait of me done by artificial intelligence. And I looked at it. It was actually a pretty good portrait. And I thought, this is moving faster than I thought. And with my colleagues, we looked into the data, and here is the answer to your question. From a labor market perspective, in other words, what happens to jobs, advanced economies and a very small number of emerging market economies are going to see the biggest opportunity for them, but also the highest risks. 60% of jobs in advanced economies over a foreseeable future are going to be impacted by artificial intelligence. And they would be impacted in one of two ways. If you're lucky, artificial intelligence will enhance your productivity, make your job more enjoyable, and very likely better paid. If you are unlucky, your job is gone. And that also means that who benefits is not determined only by whether you were born in a more developed country or not. It is determined by the kind of job you hold. When we looked at the impact on emerging markets and developing economies, emerging markets would see 40% of jobs impacted, low-income countries, 26%. You can say, well, that gives them longer time to prepare, but also it may mean that they miss on productivity. And why is this absolutely essential? Because over the last years, you mentioned I started 2019, since COVID hit us, the world has been either in recession in 2020 or growing relatively slowly, with the exception of 2021, that was a recovery year. 3% growth year after year after year, all the way in the next couple of years, is way below the historical average of 3.8%. That was the decade before COVID. So if we want to see better opportunities, increase in standard of living, we need more growth. And to have more growth, we need more productivity.
So if artificial intelligence keeps accelerating at the pace that some people say that it is, where could the rate of growth go to from this 3% kind of grind that you see for the foreseeable future without it?
Well, let me just say the following. We did the paper you mentioned. We did a very interesting analysis on the prerequisites for artificial intelligence to be adopted in a country more effectively. And we came up with 4 criteria: digital infrastructure, human capital and labor market flexibility, innovation, and ethics and governance. And then we ranked all countries, actually 125 countries, on the basis of this criteria. Who came on top? Any guesses here?
The United States.
Number 2.
China.
Well, let me kind of shorten the suspense. Singapore. And if you ever have been interacting with, say, the Singaporean minister responsible for artificial intelligence, if you have been there in their engagements, you would see why. So we have Singapore, United States, Denmark. Then a small group, and you can go Germany, Australia, UK, a small group of advanced economies here. Everybody else utterly unprepared for this new world.
So here comes a question, especially given the fact that the United States is putting a lot of money into this. China's putting a lot of money into this. They might not have all of those prerequisites, but they do have a lot of money that they're funneling into the development of this. Does that make your job harder? Because there's almost a new arms race between the most powerful nations that are all member states of the IMF.
What is making our job harder are 2 risks that come with artificial intelligence. One, increase of inequality. The world is already so unequal that it impacts the fabric of societies, and it spills over in protests on the streets, in lack of trust in governments. And artificial intelligence, unless this is attended, is going to deepen inequality. Those workers that would see their jobs enhanced, they'll make more money. But those that see their jobs gone, if there is no social safety net for them, they're going to be in deep trouble. And then across countries, inequality would grow. The second big risk we see from our perspective is on financial stability. Why we are concerned about that? Because artificial intelligence can lead to manipulation of data, of perspectives for companies and countries in a way that we have not seen so far. So what does it mean? Well, it means that governments have to wake up and take this very seriously. At the moment, I don't think they do. I don't think that they're looking at their level of preparedness seriously and then doing what is necessary to step up. But especially to figure out, what do you do? How do you regulate something that changes so rapidly? And how do you regulate it to bring the risks of misinformation, disinformation down, but grab the productivity benefit?
That's where I wanted to go, misinformation. We're having elections in a number of places, including the United States. A big topic of discussion here is the prospect of Donald Trump being president yet again in the United States. He did just win the Iowa caucus in the fastest amount of time on record. How does that feature into some of your conversations and how misinformation could play into some of these things?
Well, this is actually even higher concern than inequality because it has been expanding very rapidly. And what we now face is a big driver of mistrust comes from all this crap that is being thrown at people that you need to sort through. So we are benefiting in terms of you have multiple sources of information, but what we are seeing is quite dangerous. And then on top of it, you have cyber security risks. I'm born optimist. So I think we should focus on the opportunities and really reap these opportunities. But the risks are very significant and they are potentially very, very severe.
Aside from misinformation, and we're going to get back to this, I do just want to ask you, Christine Lagarde, your predecessor, was talking about Donald Trump on Thursday and was saying that he is going to be really harmful for Europe if he were to be elected again, another session of his. Do you agree with that?
I think it is for the American people to decide who is their president. When they decide, we would see who that is. For us, for the fund, what we look at are policies. What are the policies that are going to come, how they would affect the performance of the US economy, how they would affect the performance of the world economy. And when we look at the likely policies, well, in terms of being more conscious about the integrated global economy and how it benefits people everywhere, there may be some serious concerns.
Do you think in general that some of the technological advances are sort of fostering some of this populism that we're seeing grow up in a lot of political sectors?
Of course, when we first enjoyed social media, it was such a boom, you get information instantaneously, and now we see social media as a plus and a minus. I am very conscious of the fact that we have to allow transparency and data to flow. But for God's sake, when it is straight lie, we have to figure out a way to stop it. And I don't think this is being seriously addressed today. And artificial intelligence is going to make it so much harder. I mean, artificial intelligence can take, say, me, create a little speech I give in which I say, I hate Bloomberg with my own voice. And then here we go. I never ever can talk to Bloomberg. But that is.
Are you inviting it? No, I'm kidding.
So yes, it is very serious. What we are seeing is there are some attempts to regulate, protect privacy, but address this straight lies problem. But so far, not so great, to be quite frank.
There's a question just in general about some of the populism and whether that will help some of the economic projections that you're looking for. I'm thinking of Argentina as one particular nation that just elected a new president, Javier Milei, who is thought to be a populist president. Do you think that his election makes it more or less likely that they're going to repay you the $45 billion they owe you?
Okay, so far, so good. They paid. They got into office December 11th, and they had payment on December 21st. They made the payment. We actually just completed a staff-level agreement because what this administration is doing is to very aggressively address some of the shortcomings we all see in Argentina. Fiscal out of whack, spend more than you can afford. Reserves wiped out. So we are seeing progress on all these fronts. Of course, what we also care deeply about is that as this administration moves with very bold reforms, there is also protection for the most vulnerable people. And we were very gratified in the staff-level agreement. There is specific reference to how the vulnerable Argentinians, and this is 40% of the population, how they would be helped with child credits, with food stamps, with more targeted attention to where the vulnerable population is.
One area perhaps on the other side of the extreme, or maybe actually similar, I'm wondering, China has the biggest delegation here, going back to 2017, which is interesting given these sort of conflicting messages that we've been getting about whether they want international business or whether they don't. What's been the message that you've gotten from them? Are they more concerned now about sluggish growth, or are they still more concerned about some of Xi Jinping's policies and ideologies?
I have had a couple of engagements with the Prime Minister Li Qiang, with the economic team, and what I drew out of it, two important messages. Number one, China recognizes that unless they move forward with difficult structural reforms, they will see growth dipping under 4%. And what are these reforms? Opening up, continuing with opening up, state-owned enterprises, addressing the local government debt. Short term, they have the issue of the real estate sector. So that recognition that what has worked for them for 40 years is what is the answer to their problems today is there. And secondly, a very strong determination to stay engaged internationally. And this is why you see this big plane landing here. They felt a bit the supply chain revamping. They have seen some outflow of capital, and they take this seriously. In China, the main objective for this year, next year, the year after, is to shift their growth first away from being so much export dependent to more consumption dependent, and second, emphasize more the quality of growth at the time when this country is aging. They have a demographic problem. The easy way of growing by getting people from rural areas going to urban areas, pretty much, if not exhausted, diminished. So they have to come up with more reforms. It's not going to be easy, and it would require the country to stay in that lane. So hopefully here we would get a sense how determined they are to stay in that lane.
We just have a minute left, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, I know you are putting your economic projection in the next month or so. You previously had a 2.9% growth rate for 2024. Is it looking higher or lower than that?
Let me say 23 comes better than we expected by a small margin. There is some wind coming from 23 into 24. Stay put. End of January, you will see the number.
Okay. Well, I will just say this. Is the U.S. still heading for a soft landing? Is that still the
yes,
sort of...
U.S. poised for soft landing. Interest rates are probably going to start going down, I think, later in the year, but definitely in 2024. The only thing I want to say to everybody here is expect the unexpected. We have learned from the last couple of years that we make all our fancy plans, and then boom, comes a shock, exogenous shock, and changes this plans.
So 6 rate cuts for the Fed.
The Fed is going to be data dependent.
Yes.
But it is true that the world economy, and especially the US economy, has proven to be remarkably resilient. I want to finish where we started, though, on the technological change, because I think we are not yet integrating the speed of this change and how much uncertainty there is of the impact, and we have to focus on that. I'll tell you a story. My granddaughter taught me a lesson. I was telling her, as a good grandmother, how when I was her age, 5, there was no TV, There were no computers. So she looked up at me and said, "So you only had iPads?" That is the speed of change.
Kristalina Georgieva, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Truly wonderful. I bring it over to Brad Stone. Thank you so much.
Again, we're on to our next session here with my colleague Brad Stone and Satya Nadella. Thank you.
All right, Satya, welcome to Davos and welcome to the Bloomberg House.
It's fantastic to be with you, Brad.
Thank you for joining us. We talked about maybe moving this event to the Caribbean next year.
Yeah, you can watch some cricket and have some good weather.
That sounds great. If you want to lob a question up here for Satya, please scan the QR code and you can submit a question. But I want to start with a question, Satya, that I know you're just going to love, which is acknowledging this remarkable moment at the end of last week where the market capitalization of Microsoft surpassed Apple and Microsoft became the most valuable public company in the world. And it just reminded me of a moment in 2010 when Apple's market cap exceeded Microsoft's and Steve Jobs sent an email to employees. And he said stocks go up and down, but he wanted to recognize an extraordinary moment. And he said, and remember, Apple is only as good as our next amazing product. And I wanted to know, and I suspect the answer is no, whether you acknowledged to Microsoft employees this moment, and if you had, how you would finish that sentence. Microsoft is only as good as what?
I think Jobs had it right. I think if I had to sort of pick up, we're only as good as our ability to execute, prosecute our mission. Because in some sense, there's no God-given right for companies to even exist forever, right? They have to serve a social purpose. And our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And I feel that if we're building products, services that speak to that mission in the sense it's relevant to people and organizations, that's, I think, pretty unique about Microsoft. We think about people as first class, but we think about institutions and organizations people build to outlast them as also first class. And as long as we're building things for that, then I think we have a right to exist.
Did you take even a moment personally or with employees to recognize the...
In my, 32 years at Microsoft, we've gone up and down. And that's why I think the most important thing to focus on is, and this is, after all, a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. So the last thing you want to do is to fixate on a stock price, which we know means nothing in terms of what happens tomorrow, especially in our industry, which really has no franchise value, quite frankly. I mean, the problem in some sense is for all of us whether we can bet it all on what comes next, which means it's very, very hard.
Right, and speaking of what comes next, you guys have been fairly aggressive and out in front on adding AI features and capabilities to your products. And yesterday, you made an announcement where you're expanding the rollout of the Copilot tool, fueled partly by your partnership with OpenAI, into Microsoft products like Outlook and Word and Excel. Talk a little bit about that, and how widely do you expect those tools to be used?
Yeah, I mean, if I step back, if you sort of look at what has happened even in the last, I would say, 16 months, right? You have to go back to November of 22 when ChatGPT first came out. I think that was the moment which I like to describe as the mosaic-like moment. In fact, interestingly enough, it was November of 93 a year after I joined Microsoft when Mosaic first came out. I think that's the first AI product that we all could relate to and get a real sense of what this generation of AI can do in our lives. But for me, maybe the product that should have really helped crystallize the potential was GitHub Copilot, which probably came 6-8 months before that. And especially when we scaled from GPT-3 to 3.5, that's around the time when we felt that if you can take something like software development, which is, let's call it the most elite knowledge work there is, and have a tool that allows a software developer, in fact, bring joy back to software development, keep them in flow, get them to finish tasks, that to be solidified. In fact, the idea that you can have a copilot for pretty much every human task. And so we have been on that journey. And we're anchored on two real things, right? The one thing, the breakthrough is the user interface. In fact, 70 years of computing history has always been about, can you build that most intuitive user experience? That's kind of how it led to graphical interfaces or the multi-touch phone or what have you. But now with natural language, you ultimately, in some sense, have arrived at that point where it's not about us understanding computers, but computers understanding us. So that's one major breakthrough. The other breakthrough is we now have a new reasoning engine, which is a neural reasoning engine, because the other 70-year history of computing was we digitize people, places, and things and try to make sense of it, reason about it. And so we now have a new capability. So you put these two things together, a new user interface that's much more intuitive, grounded in natural language, multimodal, multi-turn, multi-domain, and a reasoning engine. Pretty much every software category, what is productivity, what is an operating system, what's a browser, they all in some sense collapse. And so that's why to us Copilot, just as maybe in the past we were known as an Office company or a Windows company or a cloud company, I think going forward we will be. We have a Copilot, we have a Copilot stack in Azure, which is all the APIs, and that's sort of what our core focus is.
Right. Now tell us, let's talk a little bit about the relationship with OpenAI and how we should understand it. Copilot is powered by OpenAI. We saw some instability in the relationship back in November, which you seem to have now come through. Is Microsoft outsourcing what you're describing as a core capability going forward?
Yeah, so I think if you sort of step back, in fact, it's probably helpful to understand. I grew up in a Microsoft which sort of had these massive partnerships. The first partnership that at least I joined was around Intel and Microsoft. I don't think Windows would have existed without Intel, and Intel wouldn't have had the success without Windows. Subsequently, in fact, it's interesting, I worked on our SQL Server product with SAP. In fact, I don't think SQL Server, our database would have existed without SAP. SAP's success of being able to support SQL Server also helped them a lot. And so in the same vein, I think of OpenAI and Microsoft. So I'm used to constructing. In fact, a lot of people talk about organic development, which of course is the core. People talk about M&A, but sort of not as much is talked about how much enterprise value gets created by partnering effectively. So that's the spirit with which I think about OpenAI. So there's a whole lot we do. So when you say outsourcing, who's outsourcing what to whom is the real question, right? So we build the compute. They then use the compute to do the training. We then take that, put it into products. And so in some sense, it's a partnership that is based on each of us really reinforcing what each other does. And then ultimately being competitive in the marketplace. There's room for, I call it horizontal specialization. There is room for vertical specialization. Sometimes some business models are in vogue. I'm a big believer in horizontal specialization, especially if you can vertically integrate everything.
Do you have to worry about being over-indexed and over-reliant on a company, a partner, whose ultimate goals and mission might be different from Microsoft's?
Look, I mean, you don't go into any partnership. First of all, there is independence in a partnership. There are two different companies answerable to two sets of different stakeholders with different interests. So therefore, you have to then create a commercial partnership in it that is mutually beneficial. So that's why I think partnerships where you enter into partnerships where one side is trying to take advantage of the other is not long-term stable. But if two partners can, and that's sort of why I go back to the history of enterprise value that was created with partnerships that at least I've been involved in across my career at Microsoft. So yes, I think you have to sort of, I feel very, very good about the construct we have. I feel at the same time very capable of controlling our own destiny. So it's not like that we are single-threaded even today on Azure. And this is not about even OpenAI. It's all about reflection of what our customers want. Every customer who comes to Azure, for example, in fact, our own products, it's not about one model. We care deeply about having the best frontier model, which happens to be, for example, today, GPT-4. But we also have Mixtral as a models as a service inside of Azure. We use Llama in places. We have Pi, which is the best SLM from Microsoft. So there is going to be diversity of capability and models that we will have, that we will invest in, but we will partner very, very deeply with OpenAI.
What is the right operating model for a company like OpenAI? I mean, currently it's a capped for-profit company owned by a nonprofit, a very unorthodox arrangement, probably contributed to some of the drama and instability in November. Have they figured it out yet? Are you comfortable now that you've got a partner with a stable operating model?
You're talking to Sam later.
I am, and I will ask him that as well. I'm asking for your opinion.
He needs to answer that question, and his board obviously, and I'm sure they're working through it. Look, I always say this, which is we invested, we partnered when they were whatever they were, and whatever they are today, right, in terms of being a capped profit, non-profit, what have you. So I'm comfortable. I have no issues with any structure. What we just want is good stability, and as I said, we don't even need, like, I'm not even interested in a board seat, or we don't need, we definitely don't have control, we have no, we just want to have a good commercial partnership, and we want to be investors in the entity, in even the way they're structured. So what I would like is good governance and real stability, that's it.
You have a board observer, non-voting. I was joking backstage, it feels like having somebody at the back, on the back of the bus without a seatbelt.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter to me, right? I mean, the board seat is not the critical path at all for us. What is most important, as I said, is we just want a board that cares about OpenAI on the OpenAI side, and that's all we care. I mean, like, that's all we can ask for. And we just want stability in the partnership so that we can then continue to invest in it. That's it.
I'm always a little cautious in these sort of hype cycles in Silicon Valley that certain technologies are being kind of overhyped, overpromised. You know, so far, for example, with the integration of ChatGPT into Bing, have the results met your expectations, or has it been over?
I think if you sort of take the combination of sort of ChatGPT usage and even Bing usage or Copilot usage, I think it's at this point you have to sort of ask yourself your own user habit, right? How many times do you go, for example? I think the real question here is the largest software business there is search, as we know. And the question is that stable? I think, like all big things, it'll take time. But I think at this point, the idea that you go to one of these agents that gets you to the answer quicker is pretty clear. It doesn't mean that search as we know of it today. I mean, Google obviously is super strong. They have the defaults on Apple. They have their own Android defaults. Chrome on Windows is the largest browser share and what have you. So it's structurally a fantastic position that they have. But that said, I think search as we know of it is going to change, and the web as we know of it is going to change. And so we have a real opportunity, whether it's with Bing, but also even independent of Bing, for example. That's why I think about Copilot as our real product, right? To me, the relationship we all will have with computers is going to be now with an agent, which will be on all your computers. And to me, that I think is going to be the defining category of this next generation.
I want to change gears and ask you about this year's elections. I think 70 democratic elections around the world. More than half of people on Earth will have access to vote in an election. Donald Trump yesterday won the Iowa caucuses. I know it's sort of fashionable to say that these are the most important elections of our lifetime. I'm curious what you think is at stake for Microsoft, particularly with the US election, and for the safe stewardship of AI. Does this feel momentous to you?
I mean, if I step back from AI, I mean, the one thing that, to your core question, as a multinational company, the one thing that I'm always grounded on is we're also an American company. So the state of the United States, politically, economically, socially, and its stature in the world across those dimensions matters a lot. So I think that, because that's our passport. When we show up anywhere, at the end of the day, we're an American company. And to the degree to which America has the relationships, they welcome, then they welcome the companies that are born in the United States. So that's, I think, the fundamental thing. In that context, obviously, in our democratic process, having that process be, well administered, that people have trust in it, I think is super important. So we've always, through the years, we've done a lot around what does it mean to support the democratic process, where it's the support for the parties, it's the support for the election process itself. Of course, the thing in AI, it's not like this is the first election where disinformation or misinformation and election interference is going to be a real challenge that we all have to tackle. We as a company have to do our best work, right? Whether in the context of AI, we have lots of initiatives around content IDs and other things that will then help us, at least vouch for the veracity of any content out there. And that's, I think, the work that we need to do. But ultimately, in the democratic process, essentially ensuring the integrity of elections is one of the fundamental challenges we have to face up to.
Whichever administration takes over, they will probably make it more difficult for Microsoft to do business in China. How are you thinking about the technology you develop in China, and how long do you think you'll be able to employ engineers working on technologies like AI in China?
So a couple of things. China is not a large business for Microsoft. In fact, if you sort of look at our P&L even, I think this is one of those things that is probably not as well understood, is it's fundamentally we do business in China in order to support other multinationals going into China. So this is the German automakers or American automakers or CPG firms or what have you around the world who depend on having commonality of infrastructure between the rest of the world and China, depend on Microsoft, and that's why in some sense we have to be in China in order to support our customers. And the same is true of Chinese multinationals going outside of China as well. And so that's really our business. So there is not a domestic business that we have that's to speak of. In terms of human capital, the way I look at it and say is the greatness of the United States has been all about being able to attract the best talent. We definitely want people to come to the United States. We want them to work in the United States, but we also want to tap into human capital around the world to be able to contribute to what is essentially American intellectual property at the end of the day. Right now, when I look at some of the machine learning papers and so on, there's as much being written in Mandarin as it is written in English. And so to the degree to which we believe that somehow knowledge creation doesn't have boundaries, and in fact, the worst mistake we could be making is to somehow shut ourselves up. The lesson of history, at least as I read it, is that the worst mistake any civilization, any society can make is to somehow shut yourself off from knowledge that's being created elsewhere. So to us, if there's great talent in China that wants to work while at Microsoft, contributing to essentially an American company's intellectual property, we welcome it. At the same time, we are very, very clear about hey, this is our intellectual property. We are definitely not going to have any collaborations that are not in alignment with in the United States' national interest.
Okay. I want to go back to Microsoft's investment in OpenAI, which is being scrutinized now by the EU and others. It feels to me like, to the extent that there was a holiday for Microsoft in terms of antitrust scrutiny, the holiday has ended. But do you feel like Microsoft going forward will now be more limited in not only the kind of acquisitions it can do, but now the kinds of investments that it can make?
Look, I mean, I think it's inevitable that, regulators everywhere, antitrust folks are going to look at, whatever a company of our size and scale does. And so that's why I think in this context, all I say is if we want competition in AI against, some players who are completely vertically integrated, I think partnerships is one avenue of, in fact, having competition. So I'm sure the regulators will look at it and say, is this a pro-competition partnership or not? And to me, I think it's a no-brainer. I mean, think about this, right? If Microsoft had not taken the highly risky bet, I mean, this is now all conventional wisdom, but when we made those investments and when we backed even OpenAI, went all in on a particular form of compute that led to all of these breakthroughs, it would have not been fun. We wouldn't have had what we have, and more importantly, the incumbents would have been the winners.
Right. It took 21 months for Microsoft's acquisition of Activision to be approved, and then almost, I think it was a couple weeks later, Adobe's attempted acquisition of Figma was going to be rejected. They walked away from it. Is the era of big deals over?
I think this is where perhaps looking at, whenever I talk to any antitrust folks, I always ask them, have they talked to venture capitalists? Because I feel the best way to make sense is not by size of any one company and things, what is a big deal, what is a small deal. There is conventional wisdom. There are no-fly zones. And then every VC you meet will tell you where the no-fly zones. So all you got to do is track, because at the end of the day, you want new entrants, right? That's the core of making sure you have vibrant competition is that there is room for new entry and new innovation. And that's where venture money is focused on. And so by category, you look at that. You take productivity, right? Sort of a place where we have, some great success in the past. But think about the number of new companies that have been born even in the last 10, 15 years, right? Zoom, Slack, Notion. I mean, you wake up and there's a big company. Why is that? That is because there's a real opportunity for new entrants. Then you say, okay, how many new search engines have been born? None. And so to some degree, that I think is the analysis. The unit of analysis is as simple as looking at where is venture money going, in which categories. And gaming, that was, we've been at gaming, we love gaming. In fact, Flight Simulator was created before even Windows. But we were number 3, number 4. And with now Activision, I think we have a chance of being a good publisher, quite frankly, on Sony and Nintendo and PCs and Xbox. And so, yeah, we're excited about that acquisition closing. I'm glad we got it through. But I think each category by category is the view.
I want to quickly ask an audience question, and perhaps this audience member went to CES, where there were a lot of AI, of course, was a theme, and there were a lot of AI-powered gadgets that were displayed. Do you feel like we're coming to the end of the smartphone era, and what does an AI successor to the smartphone look like, and does Microsoft eventually play in that category?
Yeah, I mean, I thought CES this year was very interesting. Obviously, I thought the demo of the Rabbit OS and the device was fantastic. I think I must say, after Jobs' sort of launch of iPhone, probably one of the most impressive presentations I've seen of capturing the vision of what is possible going forward for what is an agent-centric operating system and interface. And I think that's what everybody's seeking. Which device will make it and so on, it's unclear. But I think it's very, very clear that computing, I go back to that, right? If you have a breakthrough in natural interface, where this idea that you have to go one app at a time and all of the cognitive load is with you as a human, does seem like there can be a real breakthrough. Because, in the past, when we had the first generation, whether it was Cortana or Alexa or Siri or what have you, it was just not, it was too brittle. where we didn't have these transformers, these large language models, whereas now we have, I think, the tech to go and come up with a new app model. And once you have a new interface and a new app model, I think new hardware is also possible.
And is that an opportunity for Microsoft, or are you moving
Absolutely.
away from hardware?
I mean, look, for always, it's an opportunity for us. And so, yeah, I mean, we make hardware today. We have Surface devices. We make mixed reality devices. The biggest hardware business we happen to have is our cloud. We stream from the cloud. So therefore, I think you'll see us exercise the full stack of it.
Last question, since we're out of time, on a topic that I know is near and dear to your heart, which is cricket. You're sponsoring a league here in the U.S. How do you convince Americans who can barely get through a soccer game to fall in love with cricket?
Well, I mean, look, there's room in the United States for all kinds of things. But quite honestly, I mean, to us, in fact, the interesting, since you brought up cricket, actually, the next World Cup of the T20 is in the United States. I'm looking forward to
India and Pakistan.
There's an India-Pakistan game in New York.
Will you be going?
I hope so. If I can get tickets, that is. I'll go.
I think you can probably swing a ticket.
But I mean, look, it's a sport that obviously for us South Asians it's a big deal. It's a religion for us, and so we're obsessed about it. And I love the sport, and I'm glad that it's now being played even in the United States. In fact, originally the first Test match I think was in U.S.-Canada, but after the American Revolution, I think
Who won?
I think the U.S. won, but the U.S. rejected cricket as a British sport after the American Revolution. But we can bring it back.
Satya, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.